Hello, thank you so much for joining us again today. This is another in a series of different voices, shared visions. The purpose of our little conversation today is to provide an example of how important it is for us to understand that even though sometimes our voices are diverse from one another, the vision that we hold for peoples, the planet, communities, remain very much in sync with one another. The really wonderful thing about what we're doing today is, for those of you who have watched us before will know we've always had three males on this panel. Today we are excited and really honored to have three females with us. As many of you know, the history of the world has way too many examples of the major institutions, social institutions, whether it's religion or the government or the economy or education or even the family, having too many examples of where the voices of females have been silenced. And so we're really excited today to have the opportunity for an alternative kind of a conversation to take place. And in a little bit, I'm going to really enjoy having these women introduce themselves to you. But the composition of our panel is slightly different than the one you're used to also. We've usually had a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew here. Today, we have a somewhat different configuration. We have a Unitarian Universalist, a Muslim, and a Christian woman. Just to give you a very brief background on the kind of perspectives that you will hear shared today a little through these various voices. I was surprised to learn that the Unitarian Universalist religion actually started in what is now a portion of Romania called Transylvania, where in 1568 the first edict of religious toleration in history was declared. It was declared by the first and only Unitarian king, John Sigismund, and it was the first country, the first location where a series of Unitarian congregations were established for the first time in history. In our own country, the current configuration of Unitarian Universalism is really the amalgamation of two different religious groups. One was called the Universalist Church of America, founded in 1793. The second is the American Unitarian Association, founded in 1825. And in 1961, they accomplished something that is awfully hard, it appears sometimes, for religious people to accomplish, and that is to join together and form a new religion, now called Unitarian Universalism, or now called Unitarian Universalist Association. The reason I poke kind of fun of religious people is because the next perspective is a Christian perspective. It stunned me to learn that as of this moment, there are 43,000 different Christian denominations on this little planet we share. The one that you will learn a little bit more about today is a Christian perspective as seen through the eyes of the Presbyterian tradition, first organized in Scotland under the leadership of John Knox, one of the great Reformation reformers. It's kind of a diverse group of Christians, predominantly following the teachings of either John Calvin or John Knox. They're called Presbyterians because of the way they form themselves as a government polity. Their form of church government is led by representative elders. They're called, in some churches, in the Presbyterians, they're called presbyters. And they elect presbyters, but in the local congregation, their leaders are also elected, and that group is called a session. The session elects the presbyters, who form a presbytery, who govern regional groups. Presbyteries are overseen by synods, and all the synods together form a general assembly. So as you can see, Christians, as in most people, like to sort of get themselves formed in a work, in a manner that makes life efficient. And even though there are 43,000 different Christian denominations, the Presbyterians are one of the larger Christian denominations. Finally, there's Islam, which is considered one of the three Abrahamic faiths. The other two are Judaism and Christianity. It's the world's second largest religion, founded in the 7th century by Muhammad. More than 1 billion people around the world are considered Muslim. The origins in the 7th century included, or really summarized by Muhammad, claiming that the angel Gabriel, in the Christian tradition, we're familiar with Gabriel, that the same angel, Gabriel, visited Muhammad, and during these angelic visitations, continuing for 23 years until Muhammad's death, this angel revealed to Muhammad the words of Allah, the Arabic word for God, and these dictated revelations from the angel Gabriel through Muhammad were collected in a Muslim holy book called the Quran that consists of 114 surahs, meaning chapters. And like most of the religions, there are a lot of subgroups within Islam, but there are really three major groups: the Shia, the Sunni, and the Sufi. And each practices Islam somewhat differently, yet they all hold to the 5 pillars of Islam: the Quran as his holy book, and the 6 key doctrines of Islam. So those are the 3 perspectives we'll have here. Now, having gotten through that, I'm going to ask our 3 panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about themselves, as much as they want to tell us, their religious perspective, how it kind of lines up with the summary I've given you, and more importantly, how they live out their religious perspective in their own lives. So I'd ask first for Karen.
Thanks, Dan. It's really good to be here. So my name is Karen Herring. I have lived in Hudson for 25 years with my husband and at one time my son, who has now moved on, graduated from college and living in the cities. But we have been really happy to be part of this community. And during the time that we've lived here, I went back to school and went to seminary and was ordained as a Unitarian Universalist minister. So I am relatively new to the ministry, have been ordained for 10 years now. And my own ministry has been unique in that I am rooted in a congregation, but I am a literary minister. That is my title. And what I do as a literary minister is I lead guided writing as a spiritual practice for people who would like to engage it as a form of prayer, which we'll talk about today, and also as a way of engaging with the world as well. So I do that here, and I go around the country and do that, not just with Unitarian Universalists, but with people of different faiths, especially I work with a lot of Christian congregations and people, but also in secular organizations. So,
well, did you have a religious background before you became Unitarian?
I did. I was born, baptized, and raised in a conservative Christian church. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about the impact of being a woman mm-hmm. in mm-hmm. faith, the religion I was in did not ordain women at the time, mm-hmm. did not even give them the vote. Mm-hmm. And so when I was confirmed in that mm-hmm. tradition, I volunteered to be an acolyte. And I was super excited to be an acolyte. And my request went to the Board of Elders, and they took it up and took a vote, and they said, no, we're sorry, only boys can be acolytes. You may serve in the nursery. So it was the first of several ventures in organized religion that made me feel like there wasn't a place for me there, and that led me to a different path, eventually a different spiritual home. But I was deeply shaped by the Christian theology of my youth as well.
Mm-hmm. How old were you when that happened?
I would have been 12.
12?
Yeah.
We're glad you're here.
Thanks.
And we're glad that you were shaped in the way you were. Thank you.
Thank you.
Naima?
Thank you, Dan. So my name is Naima Khan, and I'm a resident of Woodbury for 7+ years now. I was initially born and raised in Houston, Texas, so I am a transplant here to Minnesota. And I am a very lay person, so not just a lay person, a very lay person. And I have been a member of the Islamic Society of Woodbury congregation. We're undergoing a informal name change right now, but for right now, we'll refer to us as that. And I've been a part of the community for the 7 years that I've been here, and have identified as a Muslim my entire life. So I grew up in a Muslim household. My parents both identified as practicing Muslims. And I really feel like kind of the main worldview, part of the 6 core beliefs is that belief in monotheism, right? That really kind of ties the Abrahamic faiths together. And that is a very core kind of teaching in the Islamic faith perspective. And so part of that monotheistic belief is that, Muslims believe that God, through the Holy Quran, which you alluded to, really kind of revealed the way that he intends for people to live on earth, and to lead righteous lives. And so Muslims really see the Quran as the primary form of guidance to make decisions from everything in terms of how we dress, how we eat, how we carry ourselves, the attitude that we have in life, and our prayers. And so I think it's a very comprehensive understanding of kind of a way of life, really. And that's kind of how I understand my faith and how I live it, is really just trying to uphold the central tenets of practice as best as I can, as well as the softer side of faith, if you will, which is more so the attitude, the relationship that one builds with God, and also just the relationship we have with people and how love and mercy manifest in our daily dealings with the people around us. So.
What are the roots of your family? How many generations have you been in the U.S.?
Yeah, so I'm second generation. My parents immigrated from India here in winter of 78, which was a apparently record-breaking snowy winter in Chicago. And so that was their kind of point of entry. And they decided that, nope, we're not going to have this much cold. And so they decided to move down to Texas.
What percent of India is Muslim?
India is about, I haven't looked at the latest stats on this, but I would say around 10 to 15% Muslim.
So it's a minority.
It's a minority religion.
How are the Muslims, or are they treated in India?
It depends on where you're talking about. Historically, there have been enclaves or little communities scattered across India that have been Muslim. So the city that my parents are from, Hyderabad, it has been a historical, Muslim enclave. But then if you go to like Western India, for example, in Gujarat, right, there's a lot more of a rife, especially in more modern history, kind of rioting and maltreatment of the Muslim community there, especially under the current political administration in India. And so it really just does depend on like which part of India and which community.
Have you noticed a difference in how you're treated between Houston and Woodbury?
Yeah, it's interesting because people have, I guess, a lot of ideas about Texas, which, rightfully so. When one mentions Texas, it's easy to kind of build those images in our minds. But it's interesting I guess it's worth noting that many metropolitan areas, large metropolitan areas in Texas are hugely diverse. And so coming from Houston, it's a port city. We're on the Gulf of Mexico, big oil and gas, big on healthcare, right? And so there was a really big international presence there. So almost every ethnic community you can think of, if you can imagine, in like really large numbers, right? So especially the South Asian community, which I come from, was like really prevalent in the area that I grew up in of Houston. And so it was a very multi-ethnic and self, like ethnic upbringing.
Yes.
And so it was interesting for me to shift to a place where you don't have that number, the sheer number of diverse communities. And so the first thing I noticed when I moved here was the lack of ethnic businesses. And so that was really an interesting observation for me, because you don't have like the same, Indian hair salons or clothing stores, right? Or halal meat markets nearby, right? You have to like kind of drive out to get your halal meat. And so it's just an interesting observation, and it does make life a little bit more difficult. But I mean, in terms of treatment, I would say, in Houston, it was a little bit perhaps easy to stay a little insular in my community. But here it's just been, phenomenal. Folks have been so warm. And, of course there are people everywhere that, have the opposite, right, tendency than being warm. But I feel like the overwhelming majority of my experience, very fortunately has been blessed with very nice and kind people.
Thank you. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you.
Kendra?
Yes, so Dan, thanks to you, and it's wonderful to be here with these wonderful women. So I'm the Reverend Dr. Kendra Grams. I'll get that all out at some point. And I am a minister in the Presbyterian Church, so Christian tradition. I grew up in that tradition, that branch of all the different branches of Christianity. But I would say I didn't know why I identified with that so much until I was in seminary, and I was blessed to be nurtured by various communities over the way and communities I worked in and lived in. I'm a relative newcomer to Hudson. My family and I moved here just this past summer, so we've been here about 6 months. But we are not new to the Midwest. I grew up in Nebraska, and my husband grew up in Minneapolis. So we are glad to be back in the Midwest after spending a decade or so out on the East Coast. It's just good to be here with the warmth of Midwestern hospitality, especially as we raise 2 young children, and we are enjoying that. And I serve as pastor now of First Presbyterian here in Hudson, and I'm really enjoying that opportunity to both lead a community in faith, but also grow my faith. And as I think about how I live out my faith, some of the core things that come are this premise, the one God, which I most often say, the God of love. God is love. That's part of our Christian scriptures. And that love is incarnate, comes to be with us in Jesus Christ. And so those are kind of the guiding things as I think about what does it mean to live out my faith, is what is God's example of love, specifically in Jesus Christ. And in other faith figures, certainly we have a breadth of that throughout our scriptures, our holy words, but what did Jesus embody in his example, and what has God shown us through God's relationship with God's people over time, and that above all else should have guidance over my life, above all other allegiances I have, all other things that ask for my devotion. It's part of our tradition that God has the highest calling on our lives. And so that's what I seek to ask every day, and certainly fall short of doing exactly what God desires, but that's where we also say that grace comes in, that God's eternal love that will not let us go no matter how much we mess it up, continues to surround us and empower us to hopefully do better each and every day, to seek God's desires for a loving and just and welcoming and peaceful world.
Well, thank you. As you can see already, we have a wonderful group of people who are enthusiastic and exciting to be around. So I'm going to throw a little wrench into what I told them we were going to do. The topic that they have chosen to discuss, and we'll get to it, is prayer and the part it plays in each of their lives and sort of how it's defined from their perspectives. But I was reading a book the other day written by an Aramaic scholar. And the book revolves around 2 things, the Lord's Prayer from the Christian New Testament and the Beatitudes, also from the Christian New Testament. The more interesting part was the very beginning of the Lord's Prayer, that the gentleman who is the Aramaic scholar translated it definitely not as our Father who art in heaven, but he put it, our Father, Mother, who art in heaven. I went to a church in the Twin Cities for about 12 years that always prayed the Lord's Prayer, our Father, Mother, who art in heaven, to the consternation initially of a lot of people. And but my question is, when you talk about God or the divine or whatever, do you define a God as a member of one sex or the other, or are you comfortable thinking of God in female terms?
Go ahead.
Okay. So from the Muslim theological perspective, the little I know is that Muslim scholarship has historically agreed, after studying the canonical works and the texts of the faith tradition, that the understanding is that God is not assigned a gender, actually. And so even though in colloquial language, and to kind of bring it down to human terms, when you see translations of the Quran, or when you read the translation in Arabic, the male pronoun is used to refer to the word God, or the concept of God. I think that the understanding, theologically speaking, is that Muslims understand God to be an entity that's beyond any type of categories that humans can assign to that entity, right? And so thinking about whether it's gender or time or space or knowledge or anything like that. And so from that perspective, Muslims really do understand God as a non-gendered entity.
But in terms of your common prayer life and conversation,
Yes.
you assign a gender term to
Yes.
God.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And is it predominantly male?
Yes.
And if you were to try to change that in your mosque, what would happen?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. So it doesn't. I think the mosque is not necessarily the place where those types of conversations would take place. It's more among the scholarship where that might happen if a change were to be considered. But again, because that's kind of the classical understanding, I think scholars would be very hesitant to say that, we want to use a female pronoun to refer to the name of God, or the concept of God, is what my understanding would be. At least for the type of Muslim community that I come from, which is very much kind of the Sunni, within the Sunni practicing spectrum of the community.
I feel guilty being a male sometimes, that in all of our prayers we use a male pronoun. And I think if I were a female, I would be upset all the time about it. And maybe that's because I've lived with 5 women. I have 4 daughters. And so I'm wondering, how about the other 2 of you? Is when we're going to talk about prayer. So when we address a divinity in prayer, how do you address that divinity, masculine or feminine?
Well, I would echo a lot of what Naima said, and obviously Christian tradition is very diverse, so I can only speak from my particular branch of Christian tradition. But we certainly affirm that God is beyond any of our social constructs, whether it's gender or sex or class, all of those things. God is bigger and beyond our understanding, so any one word can never fully describe God. That being said, even within my own tradition, gendered language is exceptionally common, and it tends to be more male. Our Father is by and large what you hear. At the same time, we affirm that throughout our scriptures, there's diverse language, some of it being female, some of it being male, to describe God. And it just really does depend on the Christian community, how comfortable people are with both the male pronouns for God, and the female pronouns for God. My experience has been when you bring biblical metaphors, so directly from our scriptures of wisdom specifically, when we personify wisdom as the divine, that's almost all female language. That does not rub people the wrong way, but the Lord's Prayer being so beloved in our tradition, those that have grown up saying, Our Father, it's a comfort thing more than anything. You can have the intellectual discussion with them about, well, God is beyond gender, but if they grew up saying Our Father as that prayer that we say so much, it becomes kind of written on their heart, is what I would say. And so that can be more difficult for that language to be switched. That being said, I try as pastor to bring diverse metaphors when we pray, and hopefully that opens up diverse ways for people to connect with the divine, which kind of goes to the heart of prayer, is connection with God. Karen, what would you say from your tradition?
Well, in interesting ways, it's actually similar to what the two of you are saying. In my tradition, though, because we're not creedal, we will be worshiping with a group of people who may have entirely different languages for God. And some who will not want to use God language at all. We have humanists and atheists in our congregations. And so when we pray, it often begins with a series of names for the sacred, the divine. A common name will be Spirit of Life. When I pray in a Unitarian Universalist church, I often say, Source of all being and promise of all our becoming. And it reminds me of some of the lists of God's names that I've read from the Muslim tradition. The all-compassionate, I mean, you can probably say them better than I, but it's a way of naming all these different, what I would say are windows to God, in the hope that one of them will open for each of the people in the room. And as you say, serve the purpose of prayer being a connection between each of us and all of us and the sacred one by any name. And so it's kind of, I'm betraying my age here, but I think about Romper Room. And you two didn't see this, but at the beginning of a show I watched as a child, the woman who led this show held up this magic glass and named a whole bunch of names. And those of us small children watching on our television sets would wait until she said our name, and we were certain that she was speaking to us. And I think of it in that same way, that we list these names and hope that they will open up whatever window each person in the room needs to connect to God.
One of the precepts of education is that while it opens doors, it also closes doors. How many doors are closed among religious people by conceiving God primarily as male? Is it a burden for any of your faith communities to have the male gender predominate, or is it not an issue really?
Well, it certainly wouldn't happen in my community.
This kind of
People
discussion
would
does
just-
not take place in the Unitarian.
No, because the understanding is that the sacred is beyond gender, and that we won't just limit our language to one gender pronoun or another. And actually, I went to a Christian seminary that had the same understanding. We were forbidden to use a single gender pronoun for God when we spoke about God.
Which was?
Either you don't use a pronoun,
don't,
as I just
or
didn't
I
in
just
that
don't know.
sentence. So I said, when I speak about God, I use God's name and not a pronoun. Or it was also permissible to alternate.
Okay.
And so, and it was difficult for some of the people. This was a non-denominational Christian seminary. And I would say that it expanded our imagination and our relationship with the sacred to practice doing that.
It takes time to relearn these kind of conversational patterns and recognize how using them nonetheless changes the whole way you think about things.
Yeah.
Just for the fun of it, what do Unitarian Universalists argue about theologically?
Is this a joke or?
No, I'm really interested. You know, I mean, one of your overwhelming gifts, it seems to me, is the diversity you have. How do you all get along?
There is an old saying that people once attributed to one of our early leaders, and now we just say it's a saying, that we need not believe alike to love alike. And so what we do is we really believe that each of us is enriched by worshiping and being in community with people of differing understandings of God, and that enlarges all of our understandings of the sacred, and that our task in being together as community of faith is to deepen our faith individually and together, and also collectively to understand what is the work that is ours to do in the world as a way of living out our faith in making this world more just and compassionate and leaning toward peace.
So how do you propose to do that?
How do we propose to do that?
All the hard questions.
I mean, it's wonderful.
It's a daily thing. You know, the way each of you spoke eloquently about the challenge of living out our faith in the world, in our most personal lives and in the larger world. It is not easy. It is full of failure. It requires grace and trying again and again. It requires forgiveness. And I think that's where the connection to God is so important. For certainly in my tradition, you know, we say that if you're working to change the world, it's not going to work until you're changing your heart.
Right.
And I hear that in what each of you is saying as well, using your own language. I would wonder how each of you would answer that.
Yeah, well, it made me think of also of the Lord's Prayer from our tradition. One of the things that part of that prayer is the plural. It's not give me my daily bread, it's give us our daily bread. And throughout, it's that collective us, or in the passage from the Gospel of Luke that brings the Lord's Prayer to us as Christians, shortly there following, you also get the famous passage, ask and you will receive, knock, which is also, in the limited English language, it's hard to tell if it's a singular you or a plural you, but in that passage, that ask, it's a you all ask, it's even a plural ask, and you all will receive. So in those actions of prayer, in those discussions of prayer, I think it gives life to us working together, and that we're all in this together. And we need to be mindful of not only our own needs, but others' needs. And so that's part, to me, of that prayer that is so central to our tradition. I mean, we pray it every worship service, saying that it forms how we think about the world, right? And sometimes you say it so much that you start missing things, but when you stop and think about it, give us our daily bread. And that's not an us that's limited to those that are sitting here praying this prayer, but just reorienting us back to the importance of love and community and seeking justice. And it's starting with very simple things like making sure all are fed, right? That's and not just fed bodily, but in spirit and in community.
So, a quick technical question, Naima. What the word grace has been used several times. What does the role grace play in the Islamic faith?
A huge role. You know, core to our concept of salvation, is that human beings really, no matter how hard we try and how righteous we live our lives and how many good deeds we rack up, so to speak, at the end of the day, if you're not in a good standing to receive grace from God, the idea is that it would be hard to attain salvation. And so really I think that focus brings back the concept of one's relationship to God, right? And the idea of the attitude one carries in life. And so that is kind of the underpinning. But it struck me some of the similarity between the first chapter, the opening verses of the Quran, and they're very similarly kind of community-oriented, asks of, guide us on the right path, right, and help us, right, provide us assistance. And so we're really also in that communal kind of frame. And this is, portions of the Quran that Muslims recite in every daily prayer that we do, and we have 5 daily prayers. So you can imagine that over a lifetime we really have this like repetition, right, continuously, of this idea of communally seeking guidance from the divine, and communally being accountable to each other in the kinds of pursuits that we have in this life.
Well, it's interested me that the conversation is predominantly talking about behaviors, the way you act toward one another, the way you live out your lives. And there's remarkable agreement, which is a gift from the divine. So why do we spend so much time, some church bodies, on not how you live, but what you believe? Because it seems to me that the things we believe separate us, and the things we share in terms of values and how we live unite us. So if you think that's a fairly reasonable statement, how do we move to less belief and more behavior?
That's a really interesting question. I guess one thing that strikes me, every interaction that I've had across interfaith lines has come with deep people who are deeply generous and clear about why they are called to serve and why they are called to behave in a certain way. And it goes to just having core beliefs that are generous, but being assured of them, and not coming from a place where I know what I believe. This is what feeds my soul. This is how I connect with the divine, and resting in that and knowing that in a deep and profound way, and not being able to bring that to the table. So that's where I think, as the church, it's important that we be open and honest about our beliefs, not in a way that says there's one way for all time, but this is how I connect, and to tell the story from that perspective and offer people the opportunity to form their own story and feel assured in that story, so that when we come together, we are able to see these beautiful similarities in our hopes for the world, and how we hope to make the world better and more loving and just and peaceful, as we've all said. So it's actually, I think, an interplay, but an emphasis on, at least from my perspective and in my tradition, knowing God is bigger than at all times. So this is my story, this is how I connect, and that's important to me. But God is bigger than. So if I think I've got it all figured out, I've made what we call an idol of God, right? Instead of actually seeking the divine.
The framing of your question is interesting, in the secular forces that are kind of operating in our larger, context, cultural context. And I think that belief, it can't necessarily be seen divorced of behavior, in my opinion, right? Because our beliefs and our values really drive how we behave, our outlook in life, our worldview. And so I think that having that as an underpinning, and then sharing, of course, like the weight of how much, it's one thing to have faith, it's so important to have action that's paired with that, right? And I think that holds true for so many faith traditions. And so I feel like it's maybe asking what are the things that we share enough where we can move forward on these agreed upon, needs that our community has, right? And really kind of beginning to have those deeper conversations and perhaps even collaborations. That would be the next step of that in my view.
Excuse me.
Well, that just makes good sense, because when you engage in an activity with someone, you build relationship, and it's part of my theology is that in our relationship with one another, even across faith traditions, perhaps especially across faith traditions, that is one way in which our own relationship with the sacred is revealed, because we come to understand ourselves differently in that as well. And when you were talking, Kendra, about the narrowness of defining God in a certain way, I was just thinking, in a sense, this idea that God can only be one gender or another, or one religion or another, it's a model of scarcity for God. It's like trying to understand God in human terms, and in doing so, we limit God to something that is not at all about the abundance that most of us understand God to be about. Something that is so overspilling with compassion and love and possibility that we can't name it, we can't understand it. And if that's who God is, then how could any of us completely know? Anyway.
I was going to say, excuse me, often look at conversations like this through the eyes of a sociologist, and thinking in terms of ethnocentrism, the tendency to take for granted the superiority of your own group, which we all have, and the importance to the continuation of a group to having a certain level of ethnocentric behavior. You just sort of have to have that belief to stick together, and to look at the positive side of that. There's certainly a negative side, but a positive side, it just dawns on me as I hear you conversing, that this is maybe a part of God's plan to have such diverse religious beliefs, because if you can sit and talk about them like this, we all grow, we all expand our understanding. If we all thought the same, believed the same, acted the same, we'd never grow. We would be like the Dead Sea. We'd finally choke on our own salt. So thanks be to God, however we define it, that he, she is bringing diverse ideas together, because it keeps us stimulated and growing and understanding and getting closer to God. True or false?
True.
I would say true.
Absolutely.
Well, we've gone way over the time that has been allotted to us. And Nate, bless his heart, said we've gone this far, but you can go longer. And I know we're going to have to stop now. We're probably not quite at an hour, and the nice people who do this will scramble to fill in the time when it's on. But I think we probably ought to bring our discussion to a close at this time. I really thank you, and to those of you who are watching, we're grateful for your presence with us. If you find this helpful, don't be afraid to contact the folks here at the station and let them know. But I hope it has been as helpful and growth-oriented to you as it has been to me. And so our warmest thanks to all of you, especially in this busy holiday season when we're doing this, to set aside time to expand our minds, increase our love and hope, and to add renewed joy to our lives.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.